Hello guys, welcome to another video. Here we have an interesting lens to look at. The Tokina 28 to 70mm 2.8 with a 77mm filter thread on the top. So let's take a closer look at it. So this is the lens in question, the Tokina ATX Pro 28 to 70mm. It's well built. It does not have any image stabilization on it, so you just have manual and autofocus. Minimum focus is 0.7 meters, and obviously it's a 2.8 aperture lens, so that means you'll be able to throw the background out of focus. We're just going to have a quick look. It's obviously all metal mount. Has quite a decent lens hood on it. As you can see, there's a filter on there which I put on to protect the lens. However, it is a very interesting lens. It's all metal. It has two forms of autofocus. Obviously you have the manual and autofocus button there, but you can adjust the focus by pulling the actual zoom ring in, and it goes into manual mode, and then you just push it forward and it goes into autofocus, which is quite handy. It's constructed out of heavy metals and steel, so it is really heavy. I could imagine you could certainly throw this at someone and it would certainly knock them out. Has a very decent and grippable zoom ring. The focus ring is nice and smooth and feels well damped, and obviously that focal length of 28 to 70 is a bit shorter than the Canon equivalent, which is 24 to 70. However, I don't think you're going to lose too much just by losing 4mm. It is a full frame EF lens, so it will fit on APS-C, crop sensor cameras as well as full frame. It has a velvety covering for the lens hood, and it easily detaches, and it just feels like a standard Canon one, to be honest with you, in terms of quality. But in terms of how it feels in the hand, it is really dense and heavy, and I would certainly think it should be a quality product. But what we're going to do now is we're going to test this on full frame and APS-C and see how it does and what sort of images it can produce. So stay tuned, and I hope to show you those examples shortly. Hello everyone, welcome to this video. As you've watched already, you've seen the lens in my hand and had a look at what it looks like. In this part of the video, I'm going to discuss the images and we're going to look at them. And hopefully this will give you an indication on the quality this lens can render, and it'll be up to you to see if you like what you see. So first of all, let's start off at looking at a 2.8 aperture picture at 28mm. Straight off the bat, I can see we've got heavy vignetting there, which obviously will go away once we stop it down, but it doesn't look good to start off with, and if I'm honest with you, it looks quite blurred in the corners as well, and I do seem to see a bit of green fringing around the frame of the windows, so it doesn't look too fantastic at 2.8 if I'm honest with you. Let's zoom in and have a look, but looking at the image, it does look pretty bad. So obviously we've got a picture of a museum here, and we're just gonna zoom in and have a look more into the picture itself, up to about 100%. So let me just zoom in a bit. 50%. We look in the corners, it's a bit dark in the corners there. Come a bit further down. As you can see here, it's a bit blurry all the way down here in the corner. Even at the bottom of the image, it seems to be quite blurry. If we keep going into up to 100%, the frame of the windows does look a bit green to me, but apart from the colour fringing, it's not too bad at 2.8. But it doesn't look too fantastic if I'm honest with you. We just fit to screen again. It's up to you if you like this image, but again, I think the vignetting at 2.8 is really bad. I don't like it at all. Let's move on to f8 at 28mm. This is a cheaper alternative, this lens, versus the Canon 24-70s, which cost about £1,500, or the later versions about around £2,000. So it's a lot of money for the Canon version of this lens. I picked this up for approximately £200, so it is a cheap alternative. However, it's not too fantastic, as you've seen. Let's have a look at f8. Again, the vignetting has gone completely, so it looks great, but it defeats the point of having obviously an f8 lens. Obviously, a lot of the green fringing has gone away, and it does look a lot better. The vignetting in the corners has completely gone away. As you can see, it's a lot sharper in the corners. So let's just have a look. Let's go into 100% to have a look at those corners. There still is a bit of blurriness in the corners, if I'm honest with you, even at f8. So if I'm honest with you, I'm sort of disappointed with the lens in terms of what it can resolve in terms of quality. Let's have a look again in the window, see how they look. It doesn't look fantastic, if I'm honest with you. There does seem to still be a bit of green fringing. I don't know if you can see this in the video, but at 200% I can see some green fringing in there, and a tiny bit of magenta as well, even at f8. So it's not too fantastic, if I'm honest with you. But it's not too bad for a £200 lens. Let's move to f16 at f16 at 28mm. Let's have a look at that. There's not a great difference. There is a tiny bit more sharpness in the corner though, if I'm honest. If we look at that, I don't see much blurriness there. Only in the far edges of the corner is a bit of blurriness, but it's not too bad actually. If we try and zoom in at 200% to have a look at the chromatic aberration that I've seen, if I'm honest with you, there still seems to be a tiny bit there, but I don't think it's too noticeable. So I think you wouldn't be too disappointed at f16. But in terms of overall image quality at f16, it's fine. But you've got to remember, it is an old lens. It's very old. And obviously you can pick these up for around £200 off eBay. So at 2.8, let's have a look at 50mm. So we fit it to screen, and this is how it should look. Again, I'm looking at the corners and it looks pretty horrific, if I'm honest with you. Really bad. You know, we're talking about, I don't know, maybe 5 centimeters of the actual corners that isn't usable, because it's really blurry there. Even the bottom part of the image here looks a bit blurry. As you can see, that post there doesn't look too fantastic either. But then again, that's what 2.8 does, it blurs out the background. But I must admit, the corners don't look too great. But we'll be able to see more in regards to how it resolves images in the corners at higher f-stops in a minute. But I must admit, it's you still see fringing in there, unfortunately, but you'll have to use in-camera correction. I do not use in-camera correction at all, because I believe you should do that in the editing stage, which Adobe Photoshop can sort that out for you. So let's have a look at 5.6 at 50mm. The corners still look blurry to me, if I'm honest with you. So I'm not impressed at f5.6. It should be doing better than this. We can have a look and zoom in a bit more if you want to have a look. We're at a 100% there. It still looks really blurry there. In terms of chromatic aberration, I don't see much of it there at 5.6, so that's good to know at 50mm that it sort of has resolved that chromatic aberration issue there at 50mm. So I think at 2.8 this lens certainly does struggle, and you may want to consider other alternatives. In the far edges of the image though, if I'm honest with you, we do have blurriness. So obviously at 5.6 it's not too great in terms of the corners and the sides of your picture, but the centre seems to be reasonably good if we just fix the screen and zoom into the door. It looks relatively sharp in the middle. Sharpness seems to be fine. I must admit contrast is a bit off in these images. I have not corrected them as I've said, but I think for £200 you can't really complain too much. So let's move on and have a look at the image at f8 at 50mm. So 50mm at f8. Even at f8 the corners do appear to be blurry. We can always zoom into the far corner again. As you can see, a good 5cm is lost in that corner. Also here in the road, that's not that clear, and some of the post at the bottom here seems to be not sharp. So even the top, if I'm honest with you, if we zoom in at 100%, I think we'll find that 200% there, it's still not in focus there. At f8 you would have expected that. So I must admit, it is a disappointing lens for sharpness compared to Canons or Tamrons or Sigmas, Nikons. You may be disappointed with the resolution of the sharpness you're getting. As I mentioned before, there was chromatic aberration seeable at 2.8. Looking at that at f8, I don't see any there. There might be a touch of green fringe in there, but I don't see any magenta highlights there. So again, you will be probably happy with that. Let's move on to 2.8 at 70mm. So we fit it to screen. Again, I'm going to be honest with you, the corners look quite bad again. If we zoom in here again at 100%, there's still a massive portion of it that is not focused and is blurred out. Here you can see clearly with that post there, it's not in focus. Obviously 2.8 will blow it out of the background, but it still doesn't look too fantastic. But we'll be able to see more when we change the aperture and see if that resolves that problem. But I'm not too impressed at the present. In the centre, let's have a look how we're doing in the centre. It doesn't look sharp in the middle. I don't know if you can notice that in the image here, in the video, sorry. But from what I can see, it is a bit out of focus. The detail of the stone here is not clear. So unfortunately it seems to be a fail for me at 2.8. Let's have a look at 5.6. Again, that was at 100%, as you can see there in the image. Let's have a look at 70mm at 5.6. So looking again at this at 5.6, we can see that the centre is definitely in focus. Disappointing that the post there is out of focus, I can clearly see that. And in the corners, again, I don't see a dramatic improvement in sharpness there, so it doesn't look too great, unfortunately. Bit disappointing at 5.6. Normally 5.6 jumps and changes a few things in terms of sharpness. Let's have a look in the middle, see if that improved that sharpness at the, in the middle, in the centre, where it needs to be sharp. It looks pretty decent. Again, in all these images, the contrast is a bit on the poor side, so you'll have to amend the contrast and maybe add some sharpening to your images, because I always believe that you should do your editing for your images in Photoshop or any other editing program rather than do it in camera, because the inbuilt corrections that are in cameras are great and fantastic, but sometimes you need to learn a few things and experiment with different filters, different settings, and different contrasts. But again, I'm not too pleased with this lens, if I'm honest with you. As I mentioned, chromatic aberration seems to go away generally in most lenses when you approach an aperture of 5.6, no matter what the focal length is. Obviously, at 2.8, I think this lens does struggle to get rid of chromatic aberration even at f8, as you've seen in the previous example. But let's have a look at our last example for this museum that we've been taking pictures of, which is at f8 at 70mm. Let's see if we get a dramatic improvement in sharpness in the corners as well as the centre. So again, looking at the corners, there was a tiny bit of improvement that I saw there. Let's move on over to the post here. The post is coming better, coming back into focus a little bit, but it still is a tiny bit out of focus. And at f8 at this distance, it should really, the foreground should definitely be in focus. You know, it is troubling to see that at f8 at 70mm, because when you compress your focal length, you should have a significant better range of depth of field in your pictures. And if you don't know what depth of field is, basically it's your foreground is in focus and your background in focus. When you use a high depth of field where your aperture becomes a lot smaller, you should be getting things, generally speaking, all in focus, especially at certain distances in your foreground. So it does seem to be a bit of a fail here for that, and it is disappointing to see. Let's just have a look in the centre, see how we're doing in the centre. If I'm honest with you, I don't think it's pin sharp in the centre. I think at 5.6 it seems a tiny bit better, if I'm honest. Let's have a look. 5.6, zoom in. So what were we at? 100%, weren't we? So let's zoom in there, 100%. So obviously the stonework there looks pretty decent at 5.6. That's interesting. F8, and this is on a tripod using a timer, you see. I think that 5.6 it's sharper than at f8. That is incredible. I've never seen that happen before. Generally speaking, when you change your aperture smaller from say f4 or 5.6 to f8, your depth of field should dramatically get better. It seems to me that the effects of diffraction, that's when you're trying to get too much depth of field, and the lens can't handle it, begins to make your image soft, and that's what we're getting here. Diffraction is causing the center of the image to become soft. That's unusual. I've never seen that happen before in a professional grade lens. So ultimately at 5.6 it operates at its best, rather than f8, which is normally commonly known in most lenses. When you go to f8, that's the sweet spot in most lenses. So to just round this up in regards to these images that we've been sampling, I would probably keep away from using 2.8 aperture, as well as using the 28mm focal length. I'd probably use this lens mostly at 50mm, avoid using it at 2.8, and I would not want to use f8 aperture for doing landscapes with this lens, unfortunately. So for me, this lens is a fail. It's unfortunate, but that's what I've decided to conclude. I hope you conclude the same. Welcome to this segment. In this segment, I wish to address distortion, how distortion affects your images in this particular lens. We have pincushion distortion and barrel distortion to consider on telephoto and wide-angle lenses. Typically, you don't seem to see much of this affecting 50mm focal length lenses. However, it does seem to be quite notoriously bad on this lens. What I can see is quite a significant amount of barrel distortion, and that is affecting the majority of the frame apart from the center. The corners are bad, really bad. Obviously this is at 2.8. I didn't test any samples of barrel distortion and pincushion distortion at higher apertures. Unfortunately, I didn't have the lens for that long, but clearly from the previous samples I've shown you, you can see that there is a few issues with this lens, and one being sharpness at certain apertures, as well as distortion and vignetting. So obviously we've got vignetting there anyway in the corners, I can see that clearly. Basically vignetting means dark corners, because generally speaking in some lenses they're not fantastic in the corners, and not made the sharpest in the corner area. It's normally an area many years ago they sacrificed in order to make the lens sharp in the middle. So obviously we've got a large portion of the center of the actual lens which is reasonably sharp, but the corners are really terrible. We just zoom in there, I'll be able to show you that. It's certainly wouldn't recommend this lens for any sort of landscape photography at all, or even portraiture, because you're going to be disappointed. We can have a look at the 50mm focal range, which is what you'll be using this lens generally speaking for, probably pretty much portraiture as well as 70mm. And again, the corners are not great. If we zoom in again, 66%, we can see the corners are blurry, and even the bottom and sides of the lens isn't fantastic either. You can clearly see that. So I certainly wouldn't recommend this lens. In terms of distortion at 50mm, we're not seeing a great amount of distortion there. Maybe a touch of pincushion distortion at 50mm, which is pretty unusual for most quality lenses. So obviously this lens is some years old. Obviously you've got to remember that, pretty much probably over 20 years old by now. But again, for £200 it may be tempting for many people to purchase it. I did purchase it thinking it would be a good alternative to a Canon L lens, you know, the 24-70 2.8 with no image stabilization. However, that does retail between £1,500 and £2,000, so you're talking about obviously a lot more money for it. Let's have a look at the 70mm at 2.8. It sort of significantly improves the corners compared to 50mm, and certainly compared to 28mm. In terms of distortion at 70mm, there's a tiny amount of pincushion distortion there. We can clearly see that in the brickwork there, because generally brickwork is pretty straight, and as you can see it bends a little bit. Corners, they are brilliant, but they are 10 times better than the other two samples that I've just showed you. A tiny bit of the corner section here isn't that sharp, and obviously the bottom part of the lens and the sides is a vast improvement. Overall, I would say this lens is probably usable at 70mm, but I wouldn't recommend using it at the other focal lengths if you're trying to get quality images, unfortunately. And this is a disappointment, especially from a reasonably well-known brand as Tokina. So let's have a look at the next image, which is a bit different. I'll try to get some samples of lens sharpness test cards to try and have a look and see the sharpness it could resolve, but unfortunately I lost some of those images. But obviously this gives you an idea of what you can achieve at 2.8. This is at 28mm, and clearly even with that card being some distance from the corner, you can see it's completely blurry out there, and certainly not in focus, so it's not fantastic. I appreciate it's 2.8, not f5.6 or f8, because that would probably dramatically improve the actual focus of the actual lens and make it a damn sight sharper than it is. But again, you know, I do think it is a disappointing lens in the corners. So let's have a look at 50mm here. So this is at 2.8, and obviously that shows you what it can resolve at 2.8. Typically speaking, older lenses at 2.8 are pretty bad, in my opinion. The modern lenses are a damn sight better. I'd probably rate them 10 times better than lenses that were made 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, because manufacturing processes have got better. The standard of lenses and standard of photographers has become higher. The demand is higher. The expectation is higher. So obviously manufacturers have to try and meet that expectation. Otherwise people will go to other manufacturers and buy their equipment, such as being the recent days of Sony compared to the old days of Minolta. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Sony decided to buy out Minolta, which was a well-known brand many years ago, and significantly have improved that brand, and obviously made it their own, and are doing a lot better because of it. So let's have a look in the corners again at 2.8. We're up at 66% there. Again, it looks reasonably bad, to be honest with you. There isn't a lot there in focus. Even in the centre, I'm not seeing much in focus that I would consider really sharp. It might be passable for, doing, sort of non-specific business photographs, maybe just snapshots, that sort of thing. But if you're doing anything professionally, certainly this lens will not do. If we have a look at the 70mm, obviously there is a vast improvement in the corners, but it still seems to be, if I'm honest with you, I'm seeing a tiny bit of ghosting as well, where obviously it's not focusing the light properly, and it isn't crystal clear even in the center. But I do think diffraction does affect this lens as well at apertures of f8 and f16, which is unusual for a quality professional lens. So I certainly wouldn't recommend using this lens above f5.6 at all. So that's my roundup of the lens. So if I give you a rough summary, is at 2.8 it's pretty bad. 50mm it gets a little bit better at f5.6. In terms of the centre, seems reasonably sharp at 5.6, but once you start putting it to f8 or f16, diffraction hits this lens really badly, and again you get softness, and there is a bit of ghosting in that lens because of that. So I would certainly recommend that you would not use this lens above f5.6. I don't think this lens is good for portraiture. If you were to use this lens at 70mm for portraiture, I think it would be usable. However, if you were to zoom out a little bit to 50mm or even at 28mm, I think you probably would be disappointed with this lens in terms of the sharpness you're getting, and also the terrible sharpness in the corners would certainly make you not want to consider this as an alternative to Canon's L lenses. Personally, if you've got the money, buy the Canon L lens. If you can't afford it, go for the f4 lens, which is still a fantastic sharp lens. I hope you found this overview and review of this lens helpful, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you.